Good evening and welcome. My name is Philip McCalman. I'm the head of department here at the Department of Economics here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which tonight's lecture is taking place, the Wurundjeri, Wairarong and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tonight's lecture is the Centenary Lecture, or the last in the Centenary Lecture series, and it honours Professor or Emeritus Professor John Freebairn for his contributions to both economics and public policy. And it's fitting that tonight's lecture is jointly organised by the Department of Economics and also the Melbourne Institute for Applied Economic and Social Research, where John was the director, and he was also the head of Department of Economics and also the Ritchie Chair in the Department of Economics until he retired. John has been an incredibly productive academic over the course, or over the 7 decades where he's been making contributions to both economics and public policy. He's authored over 200 chapters in books and articles, along with several books on top of that. The sort of sweep of his vision and the things that he's contributed to range from agricultural markets, labour markets, and natural resource markets, and he's made contributions to taxation policy, macro policy, and labour market policy. With all of this effort and output, it's not surprising that John's been recognised by a number of bodies and associations. He is a member or a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He is also a distinguished fellow of the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economic Society, a distinguished fellow of the Australian Society of Economics, and in 2018, for his services to both education and policy making, he received the Order of Australia. Unfortunately, John isn't able to be with us tonight. He's a bit under the weather, but John, being John, has passed along his best wishes for the event, and equally we'd like to pass along our best wishes to John, and I hope he has a speedy recovery and that he will join us again next year for his lecture. Speaking of which, John will have an opportunity to see this lecture because it is being recorded tonight and will be posted on the faculty website in a few weeks or relatively soon. As we go along through the course of the evening, if there are some questions that occur to you, there will be an opportunity at the end of the lecture for some Q&A. So take the time over the lecture to think about how to frame and phrase those questions, and there will be a person roving with a mic to give you an opportunity to ask the speaker. Speaking of the speaker, I would now like to introduce Interim Provost Professor Jane Gunn to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Professor McCalman, and welcome to everyone here this evening. I'm Jane Gunn, so Interim Provost at the University, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the University this evening. And as part of the Centenary celebration, 100 years, it's a really special way to finish up what's been an amazing year of celebration, that we welcome this evening's Freebairn Lecturer, Dr. Steven Kennedy, Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And Steven, as we know, has a very distinguished career in the public service, and it's worth us just reflecting on his contribution over the past 30 years. So prior to his current appointment as Secretary, he served as Secretary to Treasury. I can only imagine how interesting that role was and how many sort of things you had to deal with, but then previously Secretary of the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Cities and Regional Development, and many other senior positions across areas of government, including Prime Minister and Cabinet, Industry, Innovation and Science, Environment, Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, and on the Garno Climate Change Review. So some really amazing contributions to public service there, and I'm sure many stories that could be told. And for that amazing contribution, he was awarded the Public Service Medal in 2016, particularly for public service in the area of climate change policy. So that's something I know that's very important to many here at the university and of course globally and across our communities. But before joining the public service back in the 90s, in 1992, you started off as a cadet in the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I think that was about the time when I was doing my PhD and hassling the Australian Bureau of Statistics for some data. But then before that, Dr. Kennedy trained and worked as a nurse. So what a really interesting career, and I think as I'm sure we'd love to hear more about your career choices as well. So you have a PhD and a Master of Economics from ANU and a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Sydney. And it's worth noting that Steven is tonight talking at the University of Melbourne. In addition to his day job, you also have a really enviable track record as a researcher. And just drawing attention to a series of 5 articles that you penned in the 2000s, primarily with Ted McDonald, looking at what was known as the healthy immigrant effect, of which currently there is around 3,000 citations. Another journal, and this is one that really is dear to my heart, having done a little bit of work on self-rated health, that in 2002 with Tom Crossley, you published an article in the Journal of Health Economics around the testing and validity of self-assessed health status measures, cited over 600 times. So really contributing to the scholarship, and I'm sure that many would be very interested in those publications. So you are a contributor to scholarship in the Academy, a truly distinguished leader in our public service. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steven Kennedy.
An early sign of old age, changing glasses as one comes up the front. Look, I'd just like to first begin by thanking the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics for inviting me to speak today. And I would just like to join with the early acknowledgement of the traditional custodians, pay my respects also to their elders past and present, and extend my respect to any First Nations people who are present today. It is a great honour to deliver this lecture in honour of Professor John Freebairn, and I want to add my voice to the chorus of past speakers who have noted how rare and special it is to present a public lecture in honour of such an eminent person, and you all heard just a moment ago about John's wonderful contribution. Today we see faith in democracy faltering in a serious way, including growing rejection of the baseline certainties on which our democratic worldview relies. In September, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance published its yearly State of Democracy report. The report looked at 173 countries and assessed them against 4 categories of democratic performance: representation, rights, rule of law and participation. 94 countries, representing more than half of the study, suffered a decline in at least one area when compared to their performance just 5 years ago. The report's findings point not only to the rising rejection of evidence and scientific fact, but also to the breakdown of long-held assumptions, the authority of international organisations, the impact of tariffs, and the inviolability of international borders among liberal democracies. The Institute's Secretary-General writes, "Today, the state and fate of democracy in the world is perhaps more uncertain than it has been in our lifetimes." The University of Gothenburg's VDEM Institute has published a similar study, looking at the state of democracy in 179 countries around the world. Their 2025 report heralded a troubling turning point. The number of autocracies, or countries with autocratic characteristics, surpassed the number of democracies for the first time in decades. The report found that the proportion of the world's population living in a liberal democracy had sunk to its lowest point in 50 years. Almost 3/4 of the world's population today is governed by electoral or closed autocratic regimes. 2024 Nobel laureate, the economist Daron Acemoglu, puts it down to a general feeling that liberalism hasn't lived up to its promises. He argues that globally, people aren't sharing equally in liberalism's spoils, that public services are failing to deliver the way citizens want them, and that people's voices are not being represented in the way our democratic systems intended. Martin Wolf, chief economic commentator at the Financial Times, shares these concerns and argues that democratic capitalism and its central tenets are in crisis. And a recent study from the University of Southampton shows that trust in Parliament and government worldwide has been declining since at least 1990. In Australia, these forces and the risks they pose are perhaps not as grave as elsewhere. While the State of Democracy report doesn't provide overall country rankings, in each of the categories assessed, in representation, rights, rule of law and participation, Australia ranked in the top 20 of the 173 countries analysed. We are fortunate that trust in our government is relatively high and our democratic institutions remain remarkably strong. The most recent Trust in Australian Public Services report, published just a few weeks ago by the Australian Public Services Commission, found that trust in Australian public services has increased significantly in the past year. There was an increase in both trust and satisfaction for more than half of the agencies and services, with DFAT, the PBS and Medicare each scoring 80% or above. The Australian Electoral Commission typically receives trust and satisfaction scores in the high 80s, recently even as high as 91%. This matters, for as economist Justin Wolf has put in his recent Boyer lecture, Australia's institutions are not only rare, valuable and worth defending, they're the foundation of our prosperity. Alastair Campbell and Rory Stewart argue that there is a lot that liberal democracies can learn from Australia. They, like woofers, draw attention to our history of compulsory and preferential voting in particular. So Australia's system of government appears in relatively good shape. But this has been made possible through constant debate and review and realignment. Without this debate and in the presence of many pressures, our system could easily degrade as others have. So to better understand where Australia sits today and how debate has unfolded, it's perhaps best to start, as it always is, with history. In this lecture, I will consider how Australia's system of government and the Australian public service has changed and evolved in line with a growing nation from federation to today. I will then explore how with each period of change, new questions emerged about how precisely that evolution should unfold. The threads I'd like to pick up throughout include how the government ought to organise and equip itself amid shifting global environments and increasing domestic pressures. How to ensure we strike the right balance between size, shape and efficiency, especially as the responsibilities of the Commonwealth significantly expand. And how to manage the tension between stability and change to maintain the confidence of the people we're here to serve, especially at this time when democratic institutions worldwide are under such strain. Many of the issues I will touch on have been points of tension and questioning throughout our history. These include the importance of an independent and merit-based public service, our evolving federal structure, and foundational doctrines of responsible and representative government enshrined in the Constitution. The constitutional conventions of the 1890s, followed by the passing into the British Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia's Constitution Act in 1900, unified our disparate colonial settlements to form the Commonwealth of Australia and the Westminster system we know today. The drive to federation reflected Henry Parkes' call to unite and create a great national government for all Australia, including for unified defence. The Constitution itself needed to deal with one of the principal concerns, which was the division of political power between the Commonwealth and states. Emeritus Professor at the ANU Crawford School, the late Richard Mulligan, wrote of Westminster-based systems as sharing loosely linked family resemblances, with our Australian version adopting elements borrowed from both the US and the UK. We threw in some democratic practices of our own. Australia was one of the first countries to give women the franchise in 1902. In 1918 came preferential voting. Compulsory voting was introduced in Queensland in 1914 and became a federal practice not long after. As Monash University's political science professor Jim Walter argues, these early habits were also foundational to the citizens' bargain. The state as responsible for collective well-being, with citizens obliged to engage seriously with democratic government. In 1901, our population was less than 4 million. If you lived in Australia at Federation, you were almost certainly born either here, in the UK or Ireland. You could expect to live into your 50s, but not much longer than that. You probably worked in a primary industry like agriculture, mining, forestry or fishing. And in those days, if you wanted to get from Sydney or Melbourne to Perth, you'd be travelling by sea. The past century and a quarter has vastly shifted who we are as Australians, and we've completely reimagined how we live. Today we are more diverse, more urban, we're healthier, more highly educated, we are wealthier, more mobile and far more connected to each other and the globe. And as a result, we expect far more from our governments too. Today, the APS has around 185,000 ongoing employees dotted around the country. For a brief period in 1901, there was just one, Sir Robert Garran. Garran had been an important player in the Federation movement and had been closely involved in the drafting of the Constitution itself. These modest beginnings reflected what was a much smaller set of responsibilities for the new Commonwealth. Matters of trade, commerce and national defence fell under federal control, as did a smattering of administrative tasks, from managing the nation's lighthouses to delivering the post. My current department, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, didn't exist. My former home, the Department of Treasury, had 5 staff. The states, on the other hand, retained much of the autonomy and functions they had as colonies, underscored by the principle of subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the lowest possible, almost local level. Perhaps, though, it also reflected the pragmatic political realities of negotiating federation across diverse views from different states. World War I changed that. The War Precautions Act of 1914 paved the way for reams of subordinate instruments that enabled the Commonwealth to exercise control over everything, from the movements of people to the provisions of information. Though we were at war, these were quite literally simpler times. Wartime Prime Minister Billy Hughes is said to have reflected that the best way to govern Australia was to have Garran at his elbow with a fountain pen and a blank sheet of paper. The response to World War I, and later the High Court's decision in the Engineers case of 1920, which clarified the Commonwealth's powers over the states, established a far more dominant position for the Commonwealth than had been envisaged at Federation. Just 2 decades in, our federal system was evolving, partly in response to global events, partly in response to economic and social changes within Australia, and influenced by the High Court's evolving interpretation of the new Australian Constitution. A feature of our federal system that has remained consistent since the start, however, is our embrace of the Westminster-style principle of a permanent, merit-based and politically neutral public service. These characteristics have their origin in the UK and the Northcote-Trevelyan civil service reforms of 1854. Sir Robert Garran was an example of this style of public servant. By the time he retired from the service, he'd worked for an astonishing 11 Attorney Generals and 16 governments. This reflected a time of flux in our Parliament, with governments lasting less than a year, while secretaries were permanently appointed. Nevertheless, the trust placed in him by governments of so many persuasions over more than 3 decades was remarkable, and it set the standard for those who followed. Another characteristic of our Commonwealth Public Service, there from the beginning, was its egalitarianism. Griffith University's Professor Patrick Weller notes that unlike the UK template, many of Australia's public servants were from far humbler backgrounds than their UK equivalents. I mentioned earlier that one of our earliest responsibilities was delivering the post. Early public service commissioners would insist that those applying to be post office bicycle messengers were rigorously assessed, as they would be the senior leaders of tomorrow. Indeed, many of them did make it all the way, Bob Lansdowne and Bill Cole, departmental secretaries in the 1980s, started out as telegraph boys before going on to obtain their degrees after the war. Which introduces a question that has persisted ever since: what genuine representation looks like. While members of our parliament are democratically chosen by the people, the members of our public service are not. This has implications for executive power and responsibility, themes I'll return to later. But it's also relevant to the diversity of people we attract into the service in the first place. By the time Sir Robert Garran retired in 1932, global events had changed the picture once more, and our policy landscape was growing more complex still. For one, Australia was beginning to assert our independence from the UK. Secondly, the Great Depression had arrived to devastating effect. National income declined by a third and unemployment reached 32%. This, combined with World War II, called for the Commonwealth to do more again. A recovering economy, a major war effort to fund, a peacetime transition to plan for, these tasks all required government to organise itself in new ways, both in the form of new structures and new skills. And so the shape of our federalism arrangements changed once more. The Income Tax Act of 1942 effectively transferred control of income taxes from the states to the Commonwealth, establishing the vertical fiscal imbalance we're familiar with today. The APS rearranged itself as well. New departments such as the Department of Labour and National Service and the Department of Post-War Reconstruction were part of this wider reimagining of what the Commonwealth could and should do for its citizens. A new Commonwealth Employment Service would match workers with jobs. A pharmaceutical benefits scheme would provide affordable antibiotics and medicines. And new payments for widows and the unemployed would significantly expand the reach and impact of the welfare state. Now the Commonwealth was responsible for national reform at scale. To meet the moment, the public service needed a new type of recruit. It needed university graduates, including from what was then the relatively new discipline of economics. The shift to recruiting graduates was not necessarily a shift away from our egalitarian roots. For example, Australian university graduates often came from humble backgrounds themselves. And in fact, there has been a long tradition of public service secretaries coming from modest beginnings. But the recruitment of graduates in the post-war period was a shift nonetheless. And it cemented a new dominant role for the Australian bureaucracy, one characterised by a Keynesian worldview and serious policy influence. It was a time when data reigned supreme, and perhaps telling that the most influential public servant during the 30s was Sir Roland Wilson, the Commonwealth statistician. And another aspect of our political landscape that solidified during this period was our two-party system, with the formation in 1944 of Menzies Liberal Party of Australia, established to challenge the dominance of Labor. This was not without its risks for a public service based in the apolitical Westminster tradition. So the story goes, when Menzies' coalition government won the 1949 election, the head of the Prime Minister's Department, Sir Alan Brown, was asked directly by Menzies if he was a member of the Labor Party. Brown responded he wouldn't be seen dead in the Labor Party, before adding he wouldn't be seen dead in the Liberal Party either. Menzies was impressed, and it was the start of a long and close working relationship between the pair. A period of relative post-war stability for the Australian public sector came to an end with the election of the Whitlam government, which came to power with a clear objective to reshape the public service to address contemporary challenges. In office, Whitlam reformed and modernised the public service, including established the then Department of Aboriginal Affairs, the Trade Practices Commission, the forerunner of the ACCC, National Parks and Wildlife Service, as well as a range of commissions. And yet Whitlam and many of his ministers were sceptical of the agency heads who had served the previous government for so long. The emergence of the modern political advisor dates to this time, a development that continues to influence the relationship between ministers and the public service. Moving through the 1960s and 70s, Australia was not just changing rapidly economically, but socially too. There was an emerging awareness of the ways in which Australia's social and political arrangements entrenched both racism and sexism. And the executive arm of the government was certainly not immune. Debates around the lifting of the marriage bar, putting an end to the White Australia policy, raised uncomfortable questions about whether the public service was failing to represent the citizens it served. The pursuit of a more representative service remains a challenge still. The proportion of public servants staff born outside of Australia and with a first language not exclusively English has risen over the last 10 years, but a significant gap remains with the broader Australian community. Significantly more progress has been made from a gender perspective, with equal representation and a very low gender wage gap. Women today comprise 60.4% of the Australian public service workforce overall and 55% of the senior executives. Changes within government over the latter half of the last century continue to mirror broader cultural and economic shifts occurring across Australia and globally. Private sector management theory found its way into the public sector, and the burgeoning culture of new public management brought with it a raft of new debates about the size and burden of government, and the influence of politics on policy development, the role of ministerial staffers, and the introduction of 5-year terms for departmental secretaries. To address the blurring of the lines between an apolitical public service and political advice, in 1984 the Parliament passed the Members of Parliament Staff Act. The Act created a new type of taxpayer-funded but non-APS employee, the ministerial advisor. From the 80s and 90s, policymakers were expected to operate more how a business might, less rigid, more agile, responsive and efficient. And major economic reforms, including the privatisation of public assets, such as the Commonwealth Bank, Telecom and Qantas, saw significant government restructuring. The expectation of the state would become one of oversight, of steering, not rowing. And yet the philosophy of leave it to the market could only go so far when the market failed. The government still had to deal with it. Hence the proliferation of a patchwork of new government institutions, regulators and statutory authorities established to step in and fill the void. And it's at this point I'd like to pause. So far, the story I've told has been one of the role of our institutions, specifically the public service, in creating Australia's prosperity. That prosperity is surely a large part of the reason why Australians express such high levels of support for their institutions. Importantly, though, I've also emphasised how maintaining the high quality of Australia's public service has depended on being able to rethink the system. As times have changed, so have the organisation and workforce of the public service changed. Today, a topic worth considering is the proliferation of the government institutions I just mentioned. This is a significant shift and one with significant implications for our system of government and the role of the public service today. The creation of new institutions sitting within the executive but independent from departments of state and with ministers at arm's length has been a feature of Australian bureaucracy since before Federation. Back in the late 19th century and beginning with the state railway systems, the newly self-governing states entrusted many of their more technical and commercial activities to statutory authorities, strengthened in various ways. After Federation, the Commonwealth followed the larger states in its use of statutory authorities. Over time, this has meant a vast expansion of Commonwealth entities, from what began as a handful of departments back in 1901 to a complex web of around 100 Commonwealth agencies today, and now more than 1,300 bodies in operation. The vast majority of agencies serve governments highly effectively. My institution stems from my own experience, spending a number of years working at the Australian Bureau of Statistics and working with institutions such as the Reserve Bank, the Productivity Commission and the ACCC. Bodies such as these are an efficient way for the Commonwealth to take care of its ever-widening responsibilities. They tend to be repositories of deep expertise, and over time they build sustained capability in ways departments can struggle to do. But the proliferation of these sorts of bodies raises questions too, about who gets to make those choices, about restrictions on ministerial responsibility, as well as the concentration of power within the executive branch. Some of these questions have been deliberated for decades. The Coombs Royal Commission on Australian Government Administration, which reported in 1976, observed that with so much of the total resource of the Commonwealth involved in their operation, it is vital to consider critically whether traditional modes of securing accountability and effective discharge of functions are satisfactory. Many would assume that these institutions, like departments, are subject to ministerial direction. However, that's not necessarily the case, as the degree of independence differs according to the specific departmental legislation. Ministers are ultimately accountable to the Parliament and the people for the decisions made in their portfolio, but the gap between their ability to control decision-making and their level of accountability is in many cases wide. As one Senate paper plainly describes them, smaller bodies can become a great source of unsupervised executive power. The effect of this is that there can be no safety valve when tensions arise. Ministers are responsible, even though in practice they may have limited control. Trade-offs can't be made. The result is that the machinery of government can become extraordinarily rigid with little flexibility to move. When you have so many bodies so sharply focused on their own individual aims, the bigger picture can become obscured, in turn creating practical challenges for governments who want to deliver. All of which is to say, the more you disperse functions and responsibilities, the harder it can be to coordinate for the common good. That coordination task is in part one for departmental secretaries, who have a role to play in supporting clear lines of communication and accountability with agency heads within their portfolios. This disaggregation of power and responsibility has happened with limited debate in Australia. We have almost presumed this is a sensible way to manage increasing responsibility, and haven't stopped to consider the implications for some of those founding principles upon which trust in our system depends. The National Disability Insurance Agency is a contemporary example. The NDIA board makes decisions with many billions of dollars worth of consequence based on consideration of need. The National Disability Insurance Act does require the board to have regard to the financial sustainability of the scheme, but it is very difficult for the board to consider and make the broader trade-offs that governments need to make to ensure fiscal sustainability. This is the type of trade-off only a minister and a government can make. We can see similar issues in the current debate over environmental regulations, with calls to ensure that the government of the day, through the minister, bears responsibility for key decisions directly that impact matters of national environmental significance. Another example of delegated executive power arose in response to COVID. In some states, public health officials held powers that many thought should have rested in the hands of elected officials. The state of Victoria, for example, has since taken steps to shift the power to make pandemic orders away from the Chief Health Officer to the responsible minister. This is not, importantly, to diminish the expertise of those advising in all these matters, and very importantly, the importance of this advice being made available to all. However, in a democracy where accountability rests with the government of the day, those directly responsible for the decisions of the day should have the greatest accountability. These debates are more extensive elsewhere. In the UK, you have the former Prime Minister Tony Blair expressing his view that the civil service under his leadership was too powerful, too interested in serving its own aims. You have current UK commentators describing dense thickets of regulation, the quongos, boards and committees folding into each other like Escher's staircases. And you have the current UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer openly criticising what he describes as a cottage industry of checkers and blockers. Citing challenges in housing and health policy in particular, he argues that responsibility in the UK system must shift back into ministers' hands. Ministers must have control in order to be held accountable. In New Zealand, observers describe the accumulation of legally independent Crown entities and state-owned enterprises as leading to a powerful bureaucracy that makes governing increasingly difficult. In Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney has recently passed the One Canadian Economy Act, which, to use his words, is part of a broader effort with all of the provinces and territories to eliminate the barriers that have held Canada back for far too long. While the overcorrections we see in the US are clearly on the crisis end of the scale, as US journalist Ezra Klein and his colleagues argue, their basis reflects a pattern that has developed over the long term. These critiques of government institutions are not the result of a sudden reckoning. Rather, they have been allowed to build over a long period of time. In his Economic History of Australia, Why Australia Prospered, Ian McLean talks about Australia's ability to improve institutional structures as having been essential to our economic prosperity. McLean argues that because Australia's basis of prosperity have shifted, we have needed our institutions to shift to fit with those changes. Nevertheless, as my predecessor at PM&C, Professor Glyn Davies, said to the APS at the end of last year, just as good policy advice is based on facts and analysis, so the value of public service should be evaluated on its merits. So in that spirit, as for whether the institutional structure of the public service is still right to meet our nation's objectives, or have we been simply adding to the patchwork, is a worthwhile question to ask. Also worthwhile is to ask whether the significant transfer of power to a dispersed bureaucracy, free to operate at arm's length from ministerial direction, is best serving our democracy's needs. There's clearly a balance to be struck here, as with everything in government, between efficiency and accountability. Excuse me. Debating where that balance lies is vital for maintaining trust and avoiding the democratic decay affecting so much of the world. Balancing efficiency and accountability are relevant questions around our federal structure as well. The prevailing theme of this lecture has been the vast expansion of Commonwealth responsibilities and therefore power. In lieu of a transfer of power from one level of government to another, the Commonwealth is now playing on the same field as the states, in everyday areas from disability policy to housing, infrastructure, childhood education and care. Some may argue that this high degree of shared responsibility comes at the expense of efficiency and accountability. Others would argue that the system promotes competition, choice and diversity. Either way, we must remain alive to new and better ways to cooperate and negotiate. Ours is a system that, despite its challenges, has weathered well, which is remarkable given that it was designed with a very different Australia in mind. Reflecting back on January 1, 1901, the first day of Federation, Sir Robert Garran described the Constitution as just a machine. The machine had to be manned, he said, and put into working order. The ways generations of leaders have kept that machine in working order has seen it transform into something quite different to anything Garran or his fellow constitutional architects could have imagined. What worked for Australia in 1901 no longer worked a decade later. What got us through World War I in World War II needed changing again. The post-war years shifted Australia's needs once more, as did the liberalisation of the global economy from the 80s onwards. Institutional and broader reform has ensured our system of government has remained in good working order throughout. Moreover, throughout these changes, the public service has retained its capacity to provide frank and fearless advice, a characteristic of the public service since inception. As the Prime Minister said in his address to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, no nation's democracy is beyond improvement. Recognising that while tradition can bind us, teach us and inspire us, it is not enough to sustain us. because no system that derives its authority from the people will ever be the definite article, a complete and finished artefact. Countries are facing challenges we could have hardly imagined a couple of decades ago. Global disintegration, some have war on their doorstep, fracturing governments and institutions, declining productivity and prosperity, and the polarisation of communities. What the Commonwealth and the Australian Public Service does with the responsibilities we have matters deeply, particularly in light of the increased complexity in the challenges government faces. Whether it's getting the public through a pandemic, figuring out how to regulate online tools from social media to AI, helping the economy adapt to a changing climate, or integrating economic and national security advice. Our system is sound. Our public institutions are trusted, and that includes the Australian Public Service. But it will always have to be improved to meet new challenges, as the country it serves will be ever-changing. This will be key to maintaining the trust and confidence of the people we're here to serve, responding to the great challenges of our time and adhering to the democratic principles upon which our system was designed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy, for that very thoughtful oration. I'm Beth Webster, the Director of the Melbourne Institute. We've got about 10 minutes now for questions, and we have roving mics. If people want to put their hands up, I will maybe Myron, Dan, sorry.
Hello. Hi, Secretary. I'm Shikar from the Department of Employment. I'm an EL1. My question is about...
Up a bit.
Hello? Can everyone hear me? Yep. My question's about the entitlement problem. So one of the, as you mentioned, like in the welfare state, a lot of our challenges are about increasing entitlements, like NDIS and so on. Like I'm concerned about the financial sustainability and so on as well, like how once you give people entitlements, it's hard to take them away. For example, is the NDIS going to bankrupt us? Do you have thoughts and ideas on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, I should say I think the National Disability Insurance is a tremendous scheme, and in many ways, it's been incredibly successful and changed the lives of literally hundreds of thousands of Australians. But there is little doubt, as we've been trying to reform it in cooperation with the states, that it could be better focused, and it's not clear to us that the manner in which it responds to disability and the manner in which it responds to need is as optimal as it could be, with often the most striking example being the very significant rise in services to children around autism, for example. And in my view, while I'm always very fond of consumer-based, consumer-led reforms, we also have to be very much driven by the science and the evidence about what type of interventions will best respond to different types of conditions as they arise. So I made my comments around, in a sense, the governance of the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency, and the NDIS. I am a huge fan of that policy, but we need to ensure it is now significantly larger than Medicare, for example, in terms of its fiscal cost. And it's, as I said, I would argue, been very successful in many ways, but it can clearly be improved. And if we do not make it fiscally sustainable, we will lose the broader support of the community for this scheme, because it will force other trade-offs and it affects other parts of the delivery of health services. So it's not only the governance, it's frankly how we run it. In terms of a sense of the public developing entitlements, I suppose I'd stick more with the economist part of my career than the health part, and simply say, if we give people a series of incentives, they are highly likely to respond to them. And in some of these schemes, we have to think very carefully about the incentives we are providing to people and whether they're sensibly in place. we're making quite a lot of progress in reducing the cost of the NDIS. And well, as you can probably gather from the speech, I'm a huge fan of democratic capitalism. And I think if you have an honest and straightforward conversation with people and explain that you can lead them through significant changes and reforms, and you can explain how you can produce a better outcomes and better targeted policies.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for the encyclopedic way in which you've described so much this evening. Rupert Meyer, I'm a member of the Faculty of Business and Economics. My question is about National Cabinet, and I just wonder whether you could talk about the advent of National Cabinet and how you might see that evolve in the next decades.
Yeah, I was, I guess I was, well, you could say fortunate in that I was there at the beginning of the establishment of National Cabinet. Actually, I was with Phil Lowe at the Parramatta Stadium, which of course is a natural place for premiers and the prime ministers to gather with our sporting obsessions. When Phil and I just advised the states and with the Commonwealth about how we thought they might respond to the shock that was in front of us. And it was out of that meeting that the Prime Minister Morrison decided to establish National Cabinet. And in the main, I thought it worked incredibly effectively as a problem-solving device and as a device for joint leadership. I'd have the opportunity to brief, usually virtually, the premiers and the Prime Minister. And in that case, the Prime Minister, we could argue was generous, but allowed me to brief them in a very frank and direct way and frankly unfettered. And so I thought it was, in that moment of crisis, a very effective mechanism. It waxed and waned across the period. It's a little bit like negotiating the Commonwealth versus the state responsibilities. This will surprise you, but politics can come into play. And you know, for example, there was a very complex debate about the closing of schools with a whole range of factors. And frankly, just, you know, pause for a moment and think about our federation. Our states and territories are of vastly different capability. This is not in any way to criticise the smaller territories or Tasmania or South Australia, but the institutional heft they have sitting behind them compared to Victoria and New South Wales are quite different. So they're all going to respond and want the Commonwealth to engage with them in different ways. But in summary, I feel we caught something in the crisis, and actually I will often feel the public services is best in crisis because the sense of purpose is so clearly articulated that you're working towards that common purpose seems to sweep away all those things that kind of get in the way. And when you're out of crisis, you can spend a lot of time arguing about finer points. I think it's been a good institution to create. I think it can be more than just a crisis prevention mechanism. And I think given the shared accountability across the states in the Commonwealth, it will be a crucial way to solve the problems of the future, including, for example, discussions we're having today about the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the health agreement across hospitals.
Thank you very much for a very insightful lecture, Dr. Kennedy. My name's Eliza Cheney. I'm a current student at the Faculty of Business and Economics. I work part-time at DeCue as an economist. I'm also the co-founder of Future Forward Australia. My question is about the future of the public service, and I worry that, I guess, people my age and in my generation, you know, how do we get them to sort of enter the public service, and then how do we retain them in the public service so that we continue to build a really capable APS that, you know, has really talented and agile and ambitious people, so that it can continue to provide expertise and that we don't end up with them all defecting to the private sector.
I think, so I don't think there's a problem of, it's probably always been the case, but of young people being driven by a sense of noble purpose, which the public service provides. The Prime Minister and Cabinet will have 2,000 to 3,000 applications for our graduate entry program, and we'll take in about 20 to 24 graduates. The median age at Prime Minister and Cabinet is 37, so half of my workforce is aged under 37, and the median age at Treasury is 35. It's wonderful. It creates it's a incredibly valuable way of refreshing the capability of an organisation, because all of those people have just left university, have just taken the latest ideas. I mean, as a 60-year-old man, this will surprise you, but I might be out of date. And so the idea that those new ideas are coming through graduates, I think is incredibly powerful. What we will have to do, though, as people come in, is be really clear about what we can and can't do as public servants. And different agencies will allow different allow you to respond differently. We're not, as departments, independent from the executive, but we are independent in the advice and thoughts that we prepare. They can't direct us in any way around the nature of our advice and how we go about preparing it and the advice that we give them. And ensuring that people understand those differences, how you can be influential. There are other organisations, Danielle's here tonight, who stand apart a little further, and they give us a fantastic opportunity for confidence to be developed in the community of a completely unfettered and entirely independent view. Earlier on, People Managed, I worked on Ross's review, which is another example of independence. This combination of generating new ideas, seeding enough appropriate, independent, evidence-driven, fact-finding missions, if you like, or solution-based approaches, but also departments that are capable enough to take those ideas and then advise governments about how they might introduce and improve their policies. It's a really powerful and noble thing to do. I think the clear thing with sometimes young people will want to be, sometimes old people, frankly, will want to be advocates for things, and that's going in the public service. You will have to change the way you go about things. I had the great honour of being part of a team that introduced the emissions trading scheme in Australia, and the great honour of also ensuring its demise by advising how the legislation would be repealed. So you have to think carefully about the democratic principles around which you're operating as a public servant, and if you do feel uncomfortable, then you find a different place or a different way to provide, but you don't ignore having the conversation.
So I might take the opportunity to ask a question myself.
Okay.
So you've talked about how over the last 120 years, the public services refreshed and reborn and new generations appeared. What do you think will be the next generation of public service? How will it look?
Do I talk about AI now? Do you think that's right?
Absolutely.
Everyone wants to talk about AI. I guess there's two themes coming out. One is there are enduring themes. The enduring themes about the independence of advice, it being frank and fearless, about the quality of people, the introduction of graduates, for example, into the Commonwealth Public Service. That doesn't go away, Beth, even regardless of the technology changes. You must have that type of capability in your service. It's not a new thing. Some people say, oh, today's challenges are really complex. These people went through world wars. There were very complex challenges in the past. We need to have the right people in the service with that capability. It's an enduring theme, but different challenges, whether it's climate or whether now it's the integration of economic and national security, how complex that will be, or fragmentation of our trading systems. We need people. So we'll need maybe a different set of capabilities, but just similarly, those sort of really are capable people. I guess the second thing is we will, I'm lecturing today in a very, well, I was going to say old-fashioned, but maybe, traditional way. We, as a service, will need to find ways to communicate our ideas, our thoughts, our values to the broader community, because many people are receiving their information in different ways. That's an entirely new set of challenges. I personally don't think, I'm going to have the solutions there, but if we're engaging with younger people, teaching them about the important purpose and helping them solve problems, we we need to be able to talk to each other. I guess I would finish on this. One of the debates I've been emerging in the US is how important it is that political parties understand representation, that they can talk to a wide variety of the community and hear their concerns and even talk to them in a way that they can understand. I don't mean that they're simple, I mean they speak the same language and that they can connect with them. And I think Australia's incredibly well placed. I think we do that very well. But watching some of the fraying of democracy around the world, if we think we can sort of wander off, dream up the right answers and then lecture back, it's clearly not working elsewhere, and it's important that we don't fall into that trap here.
Thank you for a fantastic speech. You mentioned the vertical fiscal imbalance issues at the beginning of your talk, and those issues are quite acute now, given the fiscal position of all state governments other than WA and particularly in Victoria. I wondered how you see those issues playing out and whether they could be the basis for sort of a grand reform bargain that addressed broader productivity issues in the economy, and just any broader reflections on what is going to happen with federal financial relations in the near future, or maybe in the medium term.
It's a very good question, and one I've entrusted to the Productivity Commission to answer. I encourage you all to engage with Danielle's review of the GST arrangements, which is still underway, I think, yes, of course, and put in a submission, a very important only part of answering that question. The second bit that I've talked to my state colleagues about is, and we talked about this at the Treasurer's recent reform gathering with Treasury Mookie from New South Wales. We shouldn't forget along the way that the states have quite good tax bases they could be using themselves. So I'm not saying the way to answer vertical fiscal imbalance is the states to go out and, necessarily, raise more taxes themselves, but it is definitely worth thinking about in terms of their land tax base, the way they even apply payroll tax. What I tend to observe is that the competition that occurs in the Federation across service delivery can be quite positive, with competitions about who's got the best services. It doesn't always go so brilliantly with taxes, where the competition, a little bit like we've had a global debate about a race to the bottom on company taxes, some of this can happen in Federation and sits a little bit behind the vertical fiscal imbalance, though of course the income tax system is that change was a major point. And of course, the Commonwealth is spending around just shy of 27% of GDP on its services. Typically, it's spent around 25% in the states that are also similarly high levels. So there's two or three things that have to happen. One is all governments will come to an understanding with their communities about what is the level of services and what are the level of taxation that their community expects. Then we have to do it efficiently, and then we have to work out how to share it between state and federal government. And I'm not joking about Danielle's review. That is an important part of thinking through that question. But we'll have declines in petrol excise in the future, so we will have to be thinking about road user charging, a range of things, and how they fit with how monies are distributed, I think will be a crucial part in the period ahead. I just finished where I started. We should try and design those systems so they are robust to the incentives, just understanding the difficult political incentives that often jurisdictions will face around ensuring their own taxation arrangements remain robust and aren't eaten away in unhelpful competition between each other.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. My name's Matt. I'm really interested in hearing a little bit about, when we talk about reform and particularly around the kind of productivity agenda, very often with reform and with policies that we promote, oftentimes it comes with some form of trade-off, whether that be some kind of group or often a short-term penalty or group that is made worse off either in the short term in advance for either another group or long-term benefit that is greater than that harm. One of the things that's been quite interesting, whether there's been a kind of structural decline or some kind of factors, we're very good these days at pointing out the losers of things and how bad certain policy reforms will be without a kind of fixation or ability to discuss these kind of long-term benefits. And I'm interested to see and hear your thoughts as to whether there is some kind of structural reason as to why we've seen that, what the antidote to that might be, and what the role the public service might have in kind of, you know, playing towards those discussions of what benefits for reform could be.
I'm not a very good question. I'm not absolutely certain, if you like, of the antidotes, but I guess there's one, I guess, a couple of founding principles that I would go back to, which I tried to talk to in those countries that are perhaps struggling much more than us with their democracy. And one is highly informed debates. And so I've talked a little about making sure we get our institutional structure right. But in the recently released McKinnon report index a day or so ago, interestingly, Australians trust their institutions more than they trust their politicians. And so that's actually a great opportunity for us to, I'm optimistic about the decisions people will make. Often we talk about losers, or we'll talk about rent seekers, or we'll tend to box people into names that, honestly, at times, frankly, in working in those areas, from economists, we might think, you know, it's just a normal way of describing them, but they find offensive. So we have to have a more, in my view, civilised and straightforward debate about what's in the nation's interests. And as Ross once put very eloquently, we won't discover that in the balance of sectoral interests. We'll find the national interest is something that's more profound and enduring. And being able to communicate that to the public, I think, is absolutely the first starting point.
So we have time for one very quick question over here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. My question is about the pandemic response. So you mentioned that there was some disagreements over the dispersion of power in the decision-making and whether elected officials should have had more of a say. Now, we've just seen the opening of a new agency in the form of the Australian Centre for Disease Control to begin operations in January 2026. How do you think this could affect future crisis responses, and what are the consequences of that?
I think what's a number of the reviews of the pandemic have found is, while we had we'd written papers and we'd thought about the scenarios, and there'd been some testing of thinking through. In fact, I had written a paper with some colleagues in 2006, I'll say, on pandemics and what they might mean from a macroeconomic perspective. So there was knowledge there and knowledge in our health departments, but it was dispersed. What a CDC can bring is kind of a coherent and strong intellectual foundation for the way we think through what pandemics might look like. Pandemics, that pandemic structure and the way it affected the economy and the way it unfolded could be quite different to, for example, a pandemic that has a larger effect on morbidity and mortality, but spreads differently. And we wouldn't. And what I'm sort of hopeful of with the CDC and the manner in which it works with the states, because as we saw in that circumstance, many of these powers will sit with the states. I see it as a binding mechanism. I was very proud of what health officials did through the pandemic. They came together, they debated, I watched them, they'd invite me along to give them some ideas about what things might do to the economy, which was appropriate because they were trying to balance the costs. And I think, I've made some arguments today about thinking careful about the structure of these institutions, and And I am a big fan in representative democracies of that ministerial accountability being tightly back to ministers. They'll only make good decisions if you have a trusted institution that provides high quality advice. And as I observed in the pandemic, one of the things that I found quite disturbing in the pandemic is the politicians were doing what we told them to do, which was not always, but the nature of the crisis meant things were moving so rapidly that expertise became much more valued in that environment than it did in a sort of more slow-moving debate. And a CDC can really sort of have for us a way. It's an investment in the future resilience of our community.
Thank you. So it just leaves it to me to say a few words of thanks to Dr. Kennedy. So economics has always been somewhat obsessed with the power of the market to deliver economic well-being, and quite rightly so. But many times this has come at the expense of realising the role that different types of institutions and governance arrangements have played in the economy. All factors that featured very heavily in the thoughts of Adam Smith, but have been subsequently much ignored. So it is actually taken to the Nobel Prize of Douglas North in the late 20th century to actually reorientate economics back to thinking about, well, what role do institutions play along with the market, not in replacement for the market, but to make the market much more efficient. So North said, rational individuals lack complete information and therefore have difficulties monitoring and enforcing agreements. Institutions can provide information and reduce transaction costs and thus encourage economic activity. And I think the illustrations given today really amply ran that home. So there's now been a growing number of economic models that are built to quantify the effects of different quality institutions around the world. These are largely cross-country studies, so they're very macro, very broad. But what these econometric models are showing very clearly is that the calibre of institutions matter for economic growth, and the confidence in the institutions matter as well. Tonight's been a very rare privilege, being able to hear from a person with the depth and background of Dr. Kennedy, and it's been invaluable for me personally to listen to you. It's a clear reminder also that we should never take what we should never take for granted, and what we need to do to preserve our halcyon days. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth.
Just before we finish up, I'd like to thank Jennifer Latorre, who's organised today's, where is she? Hiding at the back. Thank her very much for organising today's lecture.